Okay, so my research is about race and neighborhood effect on housing choice voucher discrimination. I conducted an email audit study in Boston and Newton, Massachusetts, where I sent email inquiries to real apartment listings, but varied the race of the person who was applying and information about whether they intended to use a housing voucher. So, what is the Housing Choice Voucher Program? You may have heard of it if you've ever heard of Section 8, which is what the program was called until about the 90s. It's a national federally funded program that gives vouchers to low income people that can make housing affordable. Housing voucher holders take their voucher to regular apartments, and if you are a recipient of the voucher, you only have to spend 30% of your income on rent, which is about what financial estimates suggest is a healthy amount to spend on rent. If you spend more than that, you might have to forsake other things like food or childcare or education. Um, and it's been a really helpful program to make housing deeply affordable. And it was emerged in the 1970s as a response to the announced failures of public housing. When I was doing this research, a lot of people talked to me about Section 8 housing, but there's actually no such thing as Section 8 housing because voucher holders take their vouchers to regular apartments that you or I could be living in. What people are talking about when they're talking about section housing is this, I believe, which is public housing, which became associated with these high rise towers that are owned, operated, and managed by the government, with similar rules where tenants pay 30% of their income on rent. But starting in the 80s and 90s, there was a problem where public housing became associated with crime, poverty, and drug use. And housing vouchers arose to take their place. The idea was that instead of having this concentrated poverty, people could use their vouchers and take them anywhere to the suburbs or to low poverty areas that could be a lot more desirable. So, starting in the 80s and 90s, these buildings were torn down and Section 8 arose to take its place. And it's become a really important part of the United States social safety net during what many scholars would call an affordable housing crisis in the country. Since 2001, median household incomes has stayed relatively the same while rent costs have increased. And when that's happened and people spend more than 30% of their income on rent, it puts them always sort of at the brink of eviction. Your one missed like emergency medical expense or your car breaking down or a cut in hours at your job from losing your apartment because you're dedicating so much of your income on rent. Section 8 has been a really important stopgap during what is being called an affordable housing crisis. It's also gained more attention recently when the Biden administration was running for office. Part of his housing plan is to make Section 8 an entitlement program where essentially everybody below a certain income limit could be eligible for the program. And this is great because a lot of people who receive Section 8 have a lot of positive benefits to it. But there's also a couple of problems with it. And that's what this research explores. Um, 3 out of 4 people eligible for vouchers do not receive one. Waiting lists for these programs are incredibly long and can be measured in decades. The waiting list in Boston is so long that it's closed, and people who are currently being called to receive Section 8 initially applied in October of 2008. Demand greatly exceeds supply. So making the program an entitlement would be greatly beneficial. But there's a couple of problems with it. So this map shows where voucher holders live in the greater Boston area. Dots represent voucher holders and the shading represents poverty. So darker shading represents higher poverty, lighter shading represents lower poverty. And we can see that there's a great concentration of voucher holders in higher poverty areas, specifically in Roxbury and parts of Dorchester. And then areas with less poverty like Brookline over here or Newton over here have essentially very few voucher holders. And this is perplexing for some researchers because you're allowed to use your voucher to take it to other places. And landlords are not allowed to reject somebody solely because they plan to use a Section 8. You can't reject somebody because of that. But we do know that this discrimination does happen against Section 8 holders, that landlords don't want to rent to them, and partially because of stigma, partially doing with bureaucracy delays in the housing authority. And so my research then asks two questions to aid the literature. One is, how does voucher discrimination differ in high and low poverty areas? And then how does voucher discrimination differ by race? And to answer this question, I sent 304 email inquiries to real apartment listings in Boston and Newton, Massachusetts, using popular apartment rental websites like Zillow or Trulia. And each email was essentially the same, except for the name of the person applying and whether the email contents mentioned anything about a housing voucher. Names were conveyed, race was conveyed through name, and how we came up with the names was we borrowed from previous researchers that took names and they asked people, do you associate a certain race with this name? And then we chose names that had over 90% recognizability. And we sent these inquiries, and then we coded the responses on a 0 to 4 numerical scale, with 0 being the lowest negative response, and then 4 being a really positive response. And then we could compare means across different treatment groups to test for discrimination. So we found really widespread evidence for voucher-based discrimination. Voucher holders or emails that included information about wanting to use a housing voucher only got a positive response less than 20% of the time, compared to over 50% of the time, compared to emails that didn't mention anything about a voucher. And we also didn't find much evidence for race-based discrimination, but as we'll talk about later, I think that this might be more evidence of flaws within the study methodology and less so about whether there's actually evidence of race-based discrimination. Here's some example of the email responses that we got. One landlord responded to somebody who wanted to use a housing voucher. Exactly how many people is this for? What is your certificate for? And how do you pay the balance? You understand that under Section 8, you cannot take the apartment and move others in. So this is an example of one reason that some landlords might not want to rent to voucher holders, that they think that they'll move in friends or family members. Another realtor responded, yes, the owner accepted housing vouchers, but I needed a little more information about who will be living in the apartment, what you do for work, monthly or annual income, and credit. So some landlords may also require higher credit scores or higher annual income for voucher holders, as opposed to people not paying with a voucher because of stigma associated that voucher holders may not pay their rent. So here are the positive responses broken down by race and voucher status. And we can see that voucher holders across the board, Black voucher holders, Latina voucher holders, and white voucher holders have a lot less success than non-voucher holders. But they're pretty much similar in terms of race, that Black voucher holders, Latina voucher holders, and white voucher holders had similar positive response rates. And as I'm going into now, one of the implications of this research is that I think that this research doesn't actually fully capture the breadth of discrimination. So this kind of email audit design is a really popular methodology for testing discrimination in housing or employment, where you send in the same exact application, but you vary one thing like race or gender to test for discrimination. And this has been really helpful, but I don't know if it's as helpful in housing because there are lots of other opportunities for realtors and landlords to decide that they don't want to work with a client because of their race or income. For example, other researchers have found examples of realtors showing less units to Black testers or offering less positive incentives for moving in. And another implication for this research is that Massachusetts should increase enforcement of fair housing laws. So as I mentioned earlier, Massachusetts already has fair housing protections based off of race or voucher status, that you can't reject somebody solely because they plan to use a voucher. But as this study shows, this voucher discrimination continues to exist. So it's really a question of enforcement about these fair housing laws. Policy recommendations. I think that if we could make the Housing Choice Voucher Program an entitlement program, it could actually help with some of the discrimination, because if a lot more low-income people had access to a voucher, there would be less incentive for landlords to decide not to rent to them because they would be losing out on such a large market share. It could also overcome some of the stigma associated with voucher holders. I also think that it would be helpful if vouchers could cover some of the upfront costs. If you've ever tried to rent in Boston, landlords can require a lot of money upfront, like first month's rent, last month's rent, security deposit, or broker's fee. And a voucher won't cover those costs like a broker's fee or a security deposit, which can represent a huge hurdle to accessing housing for low income people. Additionally, expanding enforcement of fair housing laws can substantially increase the efficacy of housing vouchers and potentially help voucher holders move to low poverty areas if they would like. Thanks so much.